Welcome to Beekeeping Today podcast, your source for beekeeping news, information, and entertainment. I'm Jeff Ott.
And I'm Kim Flottam.
And I'm Brad Ritt.
Sounds like you got a special guest there in your office today.
Jeff, we got a treat today.
Fantastic.
Actually, we're gonna have a treat this year. 2019 is the 150th anniversary of the AI Root Company, and over the course of the next year, I've got Brad Root, the president of the company, sitting right next to me, and over the course of the year, we're going to do 3 programs with him, or at least 3 programs with him, and I'm going to sit back and listen to have him tell us the history of the Root Company in his own words and from all of the research that he's been doing. And I don't know how much you know. I know you used to, when you were living in Medina, you were able to get into the store and parts of the old factory and things, but
yeah. That's amazing, and I remember it was still doing some of the equipment there at that time, so it was really fun to go around and even go to the outlet store. Was it Ellen or was it Mary Ellen that used to run that? I can't remember. Ellie,
yes,
yeah.
Ellie.
I remember Ellie working in the back there. So that was fantastic. It was a great experience. So I'm looking forward to what Brad has to say about 2019. 2019 will be a good year.
Well, I've been here for 32 of those 150 years, so I have a little bit of background, but Brad certainly has a lot more. And I'll tell you what, Brad, welcome to our show today, and hopefully we'll get you back a couple more times a year. What we were kind of discussing earlier before we went on the air was that you were going to kind of look at this history in like about 50-year increments, maybe a little more or less, depending on what was going on. And I think, Jeff, why don't you and I get out of the way and let Brad get started? He's going to give us dates and times and places. And if there's a question you got, certainly jump in. But let's just let Brad do his thing.
I look forward to it. Thanks, Brad.
All right.
Okay. Well, AI came, really his family came to this area in 1820. They were from Connecticut. And they came to the Talmadge area and started farming. His father was a very young boy and soon after got married to somebody from Talmadge, and they decided to set up here in Medina. Again, a farming family. They set up in this area, Medina, and AI was the 4th of 7 kids born here in their log cabin. And he wasn't really strong enough to work on the farm. So he actually ended up spending more time around the house with his mother gardening. He would read books on all sorts of subject matters, occasionally help on the farm and go over and work some other local farms. But the whole time he was just learning about agriculture. In reading his autobiography, at a very young age, he got old enough to go into town with his father, and his father was selling honey. So we know he had an early exposure to beekeeping, but he learned from his father that it was very difficult to be a beekeeper and be profitable. And so he, again, started to learn about beekeeping, but sort of his interest in it waned, and he followed other things that he was interested in. By the time he was getting about 17 or 18, he decided to go out and travel and start teaching people about electricity. And he traveled all over Ohio, going town to town with his friend Samuel Bates. And they'd set up posters for the evening's talk that was going to be about electricity. And they continued to do that until 1859, when down in Columbus, they sort of tried to cross a river that was swollen and his friend drowned. So at that time, he looked to find somebody that could teach him a trade rather than going back to farming. Somebody taught him how to manufacture jewelry and repair watches. At the time, he was seeing a girl that he was enchanted with. Her father thought he was a bit of a nut. So now that he's got this jewelry business, he's got some respectable trade. So he sets up on the town square for manufacturing jewelry and repairing watches. And a bunch of bees land on his window in August of 1865. And he was intrigued by them. He knew probably what they were, but one of his workers was willing to go up and get the bees into a box. He took them home, showed it to Susan, and he said, I paid a day's wage, $1. And she thought he was nuts.
Brad, I'm going to interrupt you here for a second because there's a detail to that story that every beekeeper in the world loves. And that detail is that when AI was looking at that swarm, the swarm landed on the edge of a window on the second story of his factory on the square. And he was talking to his employee, and he said to his employee, he says, this is incredible. He says, I'll give you $1 if you can catch those bees and bring them back. And the employee just sort of looked at him. And AI, not knowing his employee was a beekeeper, the employee said, absolutely, and grabbed a box from the factory and ran out and grabbed the swarm and brought it back. So it was one of those kind of secret things that beekeepers like to tell.
Well, and even as a young boy on the farm, I'm sure it wasn't a removable frame hive.
Yeah.
So it was still a bit of a mystery to him.
How old was he about then?
I would say that 1865. So he was born in 1839. So he was 26. Sort of still his low 20s. Yeah. So he had shown this box to Susan. He got in a buggy, traveled up to Cleveland, went in and out of bookstores. They were just beginning to develop a library system up there. But one of the books that he found was The Hive and the Honeybee, written by Langstroth. And he read that thing from front to back. And that just kept fueling his interest in bees and beekeeping, the theories that Langstroth had developed on a removable frame hive. But as he looked at the equipment that was being used, it was so fancy and fragile, non-standardized. So over a course of time, he started to fine-tune the dimensions of the hive, the lumber to be used for, and how to mass produce it. So he was beekeeping right on his own property, started to set up hives throughout the county, and just continuing to grow on the beekeeping.
He was up on all this time, he was up working on the third floor of his jewelry store out in the town square. Yes. And that's where his both his jewelry manufacturing was going on and his beehive and bee equipment manufacturing was going on. And that was right about the time of the fire, wasn't it?
Well, in 1869 is when he started this business. So within a 4-year period, his interest in jewelry sort of waned, and he was into beekeeping. So at that business, he was definitely printing the magazine once he started that in 1873. And even by 1877, when he wrote ABC, he was just buying property down the street, which is the old county fairgrounds. And he built his first building here in 1878. They thought it was going to be an extension of jewelry, and it wasn't. It was going to be a beekeeping company.
The during this time, there were several beekeeping journals that were about. One of probably the most popular was the American Bee Journal, and he was writing for that. And his nom de plume was the novice, because what he did was the thing that he did the best was things I tried that didn't work, and sharing with the readers that, this is what I did and it didn't work, so learn a lesson here and don't do that. So he became actually quite famous because he was so willing to share what he learned and his knowledge and his skills. he was a very popular contributor to that journal.
And it saved him from having to write letters with each and every person. It was a way of mass delivering information. And when the bees landed on the window, it was the end of the Civil War. Sugar was hard to get, but beekeeping was hard to yield a lot of honey. So as he continued to work with Langstrass ideas, talk about his successes and failures, and put it into a magazine, now they're starting to get better yields. They're fine-tuning the beehive. And you've got a railroad that's now connected from ocean to ocean, and you can start distributing this stuff.
So he had at the time, right place, right time. If you ever wanted an example of that, he had railroads so he could deliver things anywhere people wanted them delivered. The post office was beginning to take off big time, and so he was able to deliver his magazine and his catalogs anywhere. And at the same time, after the Civil War, the education system in the U.S. began to pick up, and more people could read. So you put all three of those together, and his, like I said, right place, right time. You couldn't have picked a better way to start a business, I think.
His original location is marked by a plaque off the square, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Yeah,
and that's where the jewelry store was, and up until 1878.
So the jewelry store is down below, and his bee working equipment or shop was up top.
Right.
All right.
Yes, because he didn't live there. He lived down the street on Washington Street. And as Kim mentioned, there was a fire on the town square, and the squares actually had a few fires. The last big one was in 1870. So the bees landed. He's starting to focus on beekeeping, but this big fire wipes out everything. Rebuilt the building, got going, and decided to move down the street.
Tell me it wasn't a knocked over candle that started the fire.
I don't think it was that. It was in a different building.
I did. Okay, good. I said that'd been tragic.
No.
Yeah.
It was actually on the south side of the square, and it might have been a optician's office.
Oh my.
Yeah.
Never good.
So in the 1880s, he kept growing his beekeeping business, expanding his buildings, but also his product line was becoming homewares. So even his letterhead talked about homewares. His catalog had everything that rural America would want to buy, and it was devoting a lot of his time to maintain all these products, the pricing, the catalogs, and the doctor said he needed to back off. So his son, Ernest, who was born in 1862, was just about coming out of college. So Ernest and his brother-in-law started to take the active role in running the business. And their thing was to really focus it back to the beekeeping. And a lot of what Ernest did through his life was to go out and talk about beekeeping and promote the beekeeping side of the business.
Some of the interesting things that were going on as AI was progressing through this. Go back a little bit when he was building his factory. He ran into a financial situation where he was just about done with the factory. And when they built the original building here, they made the bricks on site. And the fellow who made the bricks and put up the building gave AI one day I'm going to say an ultimatum, but a deadline that said, I need to be paid on this day. And AI looked at his finances, and he had enough money to pay his employees for that week or enough money to pay the brick person for the building. And he in that time had become fairly religious, and he consulted with his wife, and he said, I can't not pay my employees. something will happen that will pay for the bricks. And the next day, a person from Canada came down and had been reading his magazine and has been reading the section called Our Homes, and was very taken up with AI's honesty and his integrity and his goals, and said, "I'll make you a deal." He said, "I'll lend you the money for the bricks, and you can finish your factory, and this business can take off, and I won't charge you an arm and a leg, and it'll work out for all of us. I will feel good because I've been able to make this business work, and you'll finish it, and your employees will still have a job." Like AI said, he said, "I know something will happen," and sure enough, something happened, and right place, right time.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah, and his mother was a great influence on him to be more prayerful and to try to avoid his frustrations that he was facing at the time.
I want to share a little bit, since I'm the editor of the magazine that he started. I want to talk a little bit about his magazine initially. When he started it, of course, there wasn't electricity, and the power for the magazine was either you pushed the press with your foot, or you hooked it up to a windmill. And if the wind was blowing, you got a magazine, and if it wasn't, you used your foot. The sidebar on this is when the wind was really blowing, you really got a magazine in a hurry. And sometimes the papers went in straight, but they got crooked in the press, and they came out, and people would get a issue of the magazine, and all of the pages were crooked. And AI put in the magazine itself that thank God we have a windmill, but don't thank him too much for too much wind. But one of the quirks, and I would love to find one of those crooked magazines. I know we have all of the collection here, but I've never been able to find one of the crooked ones. And Brad brought up earlier, which makes perfect sense. Initially, when he started writing for the journal, people would write him with questions. When he was writing for the American Bee Journal, and people would write him questions here at his business, and of course, every answer was handwritten. We didn't have email, and we didn't have typewriters, and it was handwritten. So he spent an inordinate amount of time answering people's questions. And every spring, of course, it was, how do I start my bees? And every summer was, how do I make honey? And every fall was, how do I get ready for winter? He was answering the same questions again and again and again. Well, it dawned on him that probably it would be a good idea to answer all of those questions in a season. So that was where his magazine came in handy. He was able to talk to hundreds and in fact, thousands of people, answering the same question for all of them. And then it got to the point where I'm still answering the same questions every spring. I can't move on. I can't advance. Why don't I put it in a book? So he took those questions and he said, rather than just make it a question and answer book, I'm going to make it an encyclopedia and make it easy for people to find those answers. So that's where the ABC and XYZ of bee culture came out. It was, I'm not going to say an act of desperation, but it was certainly an act of economics, if you will, to get all of that information in one place where people could get it. So that's the sort of the genesis of both of those works.
That's great. You know, I was just going to say that if any of our listeners have one of those crooked magazines, or the magazines with the crooked pages, reach out to Kim. He's willing to pay anything for one of those.
Well, yep, I'll pay almost anything. Yeah.
But,
well, and AI didn't stop with the ABC of bee culture. He wrote potato culture, strawberry culture, carp culture,
and
all sorts of things.
And one of the things we still do today, and of course the title has evolved to bee culture instead of gleanings in bee culture, is where that started. But one of the things that AI talked about in his very early youth, working around the house and the gardens with his mother, was the fact that they had chickens. And he was enamored with chickens to the point where he wrote extensively about talking to chickens. They talked to him and he talked to them. And he said, if you listen, you know exactly what they want. And he said, I can go out and they'll tell me if they're hungry, if they need protection, whatever. That sort of interest went away for a while, but we've got it a little bit back in bee culture again, a little bit about chickens every once in a while, because indeed you can talk to chickens, and if you listen carefully, they'll talk to you.
Did he do anything on not? This is Ohio related. Did he do anything on the perch? Because at Port Clinton, New Year's, they have the dropping of the perch every year.
We don't recall that he did anything on perch, but he definitely wrote about carp, because he would throw things into the pond for them to eat up. And Susan always thought the carp tasted like mud. So AI at that point in the 80s was just writing about a variety of things, continuing to contribute in the Bee Culture magazine, and just exploring all sorts of different things. He was active in the business until he died, but he sort of pursued all sorts of different things that interested him.
He had several columns that he made regular contributions to. One of them was called Our Homes, which I'm not going to say strayed, but wandered away from bees and beekeeping and talked about our homes. And it talked about everything from installing indoor plumbing to how to deal with disciplining children. And he felt that his experiences, and he had an audience, and he shared his experiences, and his audience repaid him. His circulation was fantastic for a magazine in that time and place. And part of it was because it wasn't about bees, it was about life and living.
Well, I think somewhere around 1890, he had about 4,000 subscribers. Today we have far more than that, but it's a much larger population.
Imagine what he would have done with a website and publishing on a website or social media. If he would have gotten hold of social media, what he would have done.
Oh,
yeah,
well,
he'd be on Twitter all over the place.
or he'd be the Facebook, as broad as his interest.
His wife contributed articles to the magazine. They also had magazines that were geared towards children and younger folks that still tied into that sort of our homes aspect of things. By the time 1891 came along, he was corresponding with Helen Keller, helping with the Delft children and the things that she was trying to work with. And then he finally incorporated his business in 1891. And by then, probably a few years later, his son Huber graduated from college, and AI starts working with the Wright brothers, writing letter after letter to get their interest and allow him to be a part of what they're doing.
Part of the evolution of getting to that point in the business where AI talks about in his autobiography and in his magazine and in ABC even, with how some of his the equipment, I'm not going to say equipment he invented, most of what he came up with was equipment that he improved. Somebody had the first idea, the mill for making foundation, for instance, was invented by somebody else. The Cowan extractor was developed in England, but the extractor was perfected here in the U.S. A lot of that and the evolution of those, the whole beekeeping industry, but piece by piece, he talks about how they came to be, and then how I think one of the stories I liked best was there was a unemployed mechanic engineer person looking for a job, and AI being AI, I don't think he ever said no to anybody, did he? He came in and he hired this guy, not knowing really his skills or what he would be good at, but he was one of the people that really developed the process for making foundation. And it was just, a random opportunity that AI had, and it worked out well for the beekeeping industry for all intents and purposes. I don't know, Brad, where are we on the first 50 years here? Are we close to
So we're about the Wright brothers' time, which is 1904 when he witnessed that first flight of them. Published it in 1905. Built the office that we're in here, 1906. And so really between that time and when AI passed away in 1923, you'd have World War One, and the things that we may have done during that time period. The company was allowed to still make wooden products because it helped to feed the army. But we were also supplying honey to Europe, both England and Belgium. And we actually had bought futures. And by the time the war ended, suddenly we've got contracts to buy honey at a certain price. The price plummeted in half, and we're stuck buying at a high price. So it almost bankrupted the company a few years after the World War One. But we persevered, we got through it, and sold the honey packaging side of the business by 1928 or 1929. We're still trying to find when they developed the airline honey brand. The oldest place that I found is about 1914, but I know he was making honey before that. But again, overall, it's a guy that refurbished his interest in beekeeping as a youth, learned a lot about beekeeping, helped to improve the equipment that was out there, educate people about it, and make a way of delivering products to them. And so he ran the business for over 50 years and really contributed a tremendous amount to the industry.
One of the other things that I liked that he was doing during this time is he would either perfect or develop another piece of equipment. He would test it out in his bee yards here, or a technique, overwintering inside, or the chaff hive where you insulated the colonies. And every time he tried something, it was either successful or it failed. And if it was successful, of course, he would say in his magazine, "I made 300 pounds of honey on each of my colonies this year using this technique, using this equipment." And of course, if you were making 300 pounds of honey and you were selling the equipment and you were writing about it, people would want your equipment. So he was a one-man promotion without a doubt. But the fact that he talked about his failures was the thing that kept him honest, or he was honest about it, and it kept his credibility going, because he did have some phenomenal failures, winter losses, and some of those things that everybody else had. But then when he was successful, they said, well, if AI can do it and he's going to tell me how, of course I need to buy his equipment. And his business continued to grow and grow and grow. So I think, Jeff, why don't we take this, leave this here for now, and we will get Brad back here one time this summer, and we'll kind of take the next segment of the industry, the middle segment of this 150 years, and take a look at that. And maybe in the meantime, if somebody has some questions or something, they can get back to me, Kim@beeculture.com, that we can get back to Brad, that we can address when he's here later this summer. How's that sound?
That'd be great. I was going to, that'd be great. Or questions at beekeepingtodaypodcast.com. Always.
Yes.
That's fine. So I was going to say, Brad, it must be exciting, and I can only imagine the pride that you feel when you look back on is that your great grandfather?
Amos would be my great grandfather.
Great grandfather. I mean, just look back on the lineage and accomplishments, and have that kind of history that's both written, I'm sure, in your own family knowledge and what's been passed down through Christmases, dinners, and all the talking, and also through national and international publications. That's pretty cool. I can only imagine what you feel.
Yes, it's learning more about AI, who is somebody that I've never personally known. It's just amazing as to how far his magazine reached and the knowledge that he provided. But we're very blessed to still have the business prospering and growing, so that we're able to reflect on the history that we do have.
Yeah, well, that's something else. And I was thinking about, you're talking about the quality and what he did, and I'm thinking back on the root equipment that I used to buy, and I tell you, it fit together like furniture, and it was as far as I was concerned, it was the best beekeeping equipment I ever ran across. And it's the standard to which when I pick up a new piece of equipment from somewhere, I go back my memory to the root equipment that I used to pick up, and I have to say this: everything pales in comparison. I'll probably get hate mail for that, but
well, it was Jeff. You're right. It was pretty much in the industry. It was called furniture. The rest of it was equipment, and that was the delineation. It was everything was compared to, well, how's it compared to root? Well. And it was practical. It worked, but it wasn't furniture.
Yeah.
So, well, Brad, thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Brad.
My pleasure.
And we look forward to you coming back a little later this summer, and we'll take it the next 50 years.
It'll be an exciting time.
Okay.
Yep. Very good. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really good discussion with Brad. It must be so amazing having all that family history and published, and not just sitting around in family albums.
Yeah, and it's sitting here in my office behind me. You can see a lot of the history of the Root Company, a lot of history of Bee Culture Magazine. On one shelf right behind me, you can see every American Bee Journal ever published, and on the shelf right above it, you can see every Bee Culture magazine ever published. So I'm seeped in history, and like most people, I don't have the time to sit down and say what happened in 1922, which is unfortunate. Someday I'll have that kind of time, I hope. But I'll tell you, Jeff, what was interesting today was sitting next to Brad. I've worked with him for 32 years. And his recollections and his perspective on the history of his family's company, and listening to him talk about the people and the places and the times, and not quite so much about the interweaving and the importance of actual beekeeping to that. He's looking at a much bigger picture, and I'm envious of that because he has that in his head. I look at all of those events, and I think I mentioned a couple of them from the perspective of a beekeeper, because that's why I'm here, and that's why we're listening to this today. The swarm in the window, the guy standing next to him was a beekeeper, and every beekeeper in the world who's ever read that story has to smile, because it's such a great story. So that's the kind of thing that I'm enjoying. I'm learning a little bit about the history, certainly, but I'm also looking at it from the perspective, a different perspective than Brad shares. I'm really looking forward to the next one, too, because I'm going to work with him here a little bit, and the two of us together are going to weave some more beekeeping into that. But I want him to get some of he started talking about his work with the Wright brothers and some of that, how that played out. And then some of the things that he did after he more or less retired and his children took over running the company. So the next two events should be really interesting. And I will pass this on to you and to people listening shortly. Early spring this year, we will have three books coming out, Jeff, on the history of the Root Company. One of them, the autobiography of A.I. Root, what he wrote himself. Then we've got a book that Tammy Horn-Potter put together on a lady named Jane Cole, who worked her entire life here in the factory. And when she retired, she wrote an autobiography, and we married her experiences with those of A.I. Root's experiences in the factory at the same time, looking at an event from an employee's perspective and an employer's perspective, and how they meshed and sometimes didn't mesh. And then we've got the next edition of ABC and XYZ, another book that AI started. So from a publishing perspective, this should be an exciting year. I'm looking again to talking with Brad a couple of times and all of the other podcasts we got coming down the road.
That's great. Every time I visit, and when I lived there in Medina, and every time I visit you now, the history from a beekeeper standpoint of where you're sitting. I mean, in that corner office, you have covered, surrounded by all that history, and across the street, all the history. As a beekeeper, it's like standing in the Smithsonian in many ways. It's exciting, and to reach out and be able to touch it, and looking back when I would live there, and being able to see they were still making hives, still making frames when I lived there, and it was. You could go across, and the Medina County beekeepers, some of those old timers in the beekeepers club that I was president of, some of those old timers been with Root for a long time making boxes, and they were keeping those machines finely tuned and sharp, and making all those fine cuts that I think all the beekeepers enjoyed about Root equipment. So a lot of fun history there, and I'm glad that Brad was willing to join us on the podcast and share that with us. It was good.
Should be good, Jeff. I think that about wraps it up for today. We got anything else?
Yeah, just looking at the calendar, I think this is going to be our last podcast of 2019. But I'm just looking back at the year, and it's fun that where we are. I mean, we started out with you asked me if I was going to ever write any articles for you, and I said, well, what about a podcast? And here we are, 16 episodes or so later. And I really enjoy this opportunity. It's a little bit more work than writing an article, but a little bit less work. It's a little it's a different knife edge to sit on.
Well, you make it look easy. I wonder if do you have another minute? Do we want to just kind of recap this year?
Yeah,
a little bit?
Let's do that.
We talked to some interesting people this year, and we don't have time to go through all 15 or 16 of them. But there's a couple I wanted to mention, and of course it was the last one that we just did before Brad was Marina Marchesi, my co-author on The Honey Connoisseur. I don't get to talk to her nearly enough anymore. She's in Connecticut working full time, and I'm out here in Ohio. But we still are able to get together, and I think some of the things that she was talking about were exciting. And she's moving forward with that, keeping that honey tasting going. Dan Conlon and his Russian bees. I've been an advocate of Russian bees since day one, and it was good to have him here, still pushing the program, still making it work. And I guess from what you were telling me, his program has been pretty popular with our listeners, so that's good to hear.
Yeah, I was looking at some of the statistics, and he's right up there.
That's good to hear. Jim, too, of course, is always fun to chat with. Yeah. And we did him a couple of times, and that's we've done him on the Kim and Jim show. I don't know if you've seen what we've done with him. We actually went out to his bee yard one time and tried to capture a swarm and didn't. And then Jerry Hayes, of course, now departed from Monsanto, and Monsanto's departed completely anyway. His wrap up of his experience there was enlightening to me. I knew a lot of it because I visited him several times, but he shared some things that I didn't see, and actually, I think probably made a difference with his work there.
A lot of people have listened to him too, his podcast, his episode. Well, one of the big ones we had, and actually the most downloaded is the one with Dr. Sam Ramsey that we had just earlier this fall, and that's a fun podcast, fun episode, and. I mean, there's not enough
I want to
words.
get him back to see if we can get him to sing, Jeff.
That'd be fine. Anyways, no, Dr. Ramsey was fantastic and learned a lot, and I think he's going to, and you were saying that he talked to us on the podcast about a grant that he was working on, and we gave the link out.
Yeah, and apparently, he was working on several funding sources and has been successful. Of course, I'd like to take a lot of credit for that, but he's doing good work, and it's all on his desk. Certainly, he's going places, and he's got some good projects in mind. So I'm glad we were able to work with him on a little bit on that.
Wait, it wasn't our podcast that helped put him over the benchmark that made the difference?
I'd like to think so. But
fantastic. That's great. I really want to thank our sponsors. We've had a couple sponsors step up and want to be a part of the podcast this year, starting with Pierce Beekeeping Manufacturing.
Well, certainly those are good people that were, I guess I'm going to say, had some foresight to work with us. And there were others too, right, Jeff?
Yes, there was. WICWAS, Dr. Larry Connor was jumped right in there and sponsored several of the episodes. So that's really good. And Kim, I don't want to get away with this year without thanking you and Bee Culture for presenting the Beekeeping Today podcast. And without your partnership and friendship, this wouldn't be successful. So thank you for jumping in.
Well, it's been fun, but this has been a good partnership. I appreciate your input on this also.
Thanks. And let's not, while we're giving thanks, let's especially thank our podcast listeners who, without them out there listening, and we do know they're listening because we receive emails and comments on all positive, just wouldn't be worthwhile. So thank you to our listeners. And what do we have looking forward? Oh, go ahead.
And tell your friends.
Yes, that's right. Tell your friends. Join the podcast. So we have a lot of plans for 2019. We're only just getting started. We found our rhythm here, and I think there's a lot more we can accomplish. You've got some traveling you're going to be doing. Yeah,
well, both of us are going to be on the road. I'm going to be at the American Honey Producers meeting in Phoenix, and I hope to catch some of those people there. And you're going to some meetings up where you are, and a couple of the things that we were just discussing earlier today, I think we're going to try and do some quick interviews when we're on the road, and then bring those interviews back and kind of share what they were, and then more about the meetings that we were at. So we're going to broaden our horizons a little bit, I hope, and be able to get more people on a program and more topics altogether.
Yeah, it'd be a lot more back and forth, and a lot of more diversity in the podcast. So that's the goal. And we look forward. And if the listeners, if you have any suggestions for interviews or shows or topics, let us know at questions@beekeepingtodaypodcast.com, and we'd be happy to get them lined up and see what it takes to get those folks on the podcast.
Good.
So that's it, I think.
All right, Jeff. It's Christmas Eve when we're talking today. So for all of you out there who are listening past Christmas Eve, we hope your holiday was good. And Jeff, I hope your holiday, you and your family, have a good Christmas and New Year's, and we'll see you next year.
Thanks a lot, Kim. Same to you. Happy Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, and have a safe one. Take care, everybody. Merry Christmas.